In 35 minutes, Viewpoint 90 looks at disturbing new evidence in the case of John Demjanjuk, currently appealing against conviction of war crimes as Ivan the Terrible. The time now is just coming up to 10 o'clock, and our TVS regional bulletin follows news from ITN with Alastair Burnet and Trevor McDonald.
The Minister says no need to start slaughtering calves now. Mr. Kinnock wins Labour approval for his economic policy. Soviet troops join protests against Latvia's nationalists. 2 Irelands at the funeral of Cardinal O'Fee. And new revelations on the island the Nazis turned into a grave. Good evening. British beef is being taken off the menu in more than 1,000 schools as worries grow about the cow disease BSE. 5 more councils, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Liverpool, Westminster and Richmond-upon-Thames, have banned home-reared beef from their canteens. Lancashire and Kent are thinking of doing the same, and Dorset are not using British beef in their hospitals. But the Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Gummer, said the public could have absolute confidence in British beef. He said there was no need to slaughter the calves of cows suffering from BSE. Labour spokesman Dr. David Clark said calves should be slaughtered to protect British cattle and British people.
The so-called mad cow disease now presents government and meat industry with a crisis every bit as serious as the salmonella scare which did such damage to the chicken industry. Again, the opposition is in full cry for ministerial blood.
We're dealing with a disease which is potentially of doomsday scenario. We do have at risk the whole of the British cattle herd. We're not playing politics, we're playing for real. And if the government and the minister isn't big enough to take decisions, he ought to resign. I repeat, he ought to resign.
But John Gummer is counter-attacking. Beef's on the menu in the Gummer household and in Downing Street, and the government says there's absolutely no risk to the public.
The best independent advice tell me that British beef is safe to eat, and I say, as a human being, my children eat it.
John Gummer relies on the advice of a committee headed by Dr. David TYRRELL, who said tonight the risk of human infection with BSE was so small it couldn't be measured. His message to education authorities?
Yeah, it's fine to be worried, it's fine to be cautious, but I think you've overdone it.
Dr. TYRRELL's committee has also apparently rejected the suggestion of some vets that the calves of infected cows should be slaughtered.
This evening I'm happy to tell you they have done their review, and their advice is absolutely unequivocal. Now the public therefore has absolute confidence that I'm not going to be pushed off what is the right action merely to curry favour with 1 or 2 people.
The National Farmers Union, whose leader saw Mr. Gummer today, is ready to back whatever action thought necessary to restore confidence.
I'm absolutely convinced that beef is perfectly safe to eat. But in the lack of scientific evidence, and that scientific evidence can't be forthcoming for a long time because of the nature of the disease, I think we have to take every conceivable, reasonable precaution.
But the ministerial line is all necessary action has been taken. So the government has tonight taken its stand. It says all the necessary precautions have been taken. It says that beef is safe to eat. Now ministers and farmers can only wait to see whether consumers accept that assurance. Peter Allen, News at 10, Westminster.
Belinda Roberts recently died of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, the human form of the mad cow disease BSE. Her husband Peter said in her final days Belinda was blind, deaf and suffered spasms. He accepts there's no evidence of a link to BSE, but he wants every possible precaution until scientists are sure.
I would say that there's no proof, and there won't be any proof for probably 10 years. In the meantime, we've got to take the ultimate absolute precautions to make sure that we do everything we possibly can, that if there is a link, we've eliminated as many possibilities as possible of that link being made.
Belinda's neurologist says the government has been slow to act.
They've rather belatedly got onto 1 or 2 of the potential problems of the disease being passed to humans. I refer here to the question of complete destruction of all tissues from infected cows who have the disease. And secondly, it seems slightly irresponsible to be using offspring or material from offspring in any form of food chain.
The government says humans have eaten meat from infected sheep, for over 200 years with no proven ill effects. They say there's no reason why BSE should be different, and there are cases of lifelong vegetarians catching the human disease. But the fear of BSE spreading to people prompted British beef to be struck off more school menus today. Liverpool's even banning foreign beef as well. The Meat and Livestock Commission is appealing for calm and saying there's no danger.
The sound scientific arguments coming from independent scientific bodies make it absolutely clear that there is no risk associated with beef.
Beef consumption is slightly down, but farmers and butchers fear sales could collapse with this latest food scare.
The Labour Party has agreed the programme which it hopes will win it the next election. Its ruling national executive spent the day hammering out the package, which includes a top tax rate of 50% and which accepts much of the Conservative government's trade union legislation. Mr Kinnock called the proposals practical policies, not pipe dreams.
After an all-day session, the leaders of the Labour Party have agreed what Mr Kinnock called tonight the clearest account yet of how we will act in government.
At the beginning of today's debate, one of the members of the National Executive Committee, I won't give you any names, said it was passionately pro-European. I said it is passionately only one thing. It is passionately realistic in dealing with the problems confronting our country now and the ones that we can see coming in the 1990s. And we have a practical document, a real strategy for the economy, for manufacturing industry, and for the caring and social services that can be applied in practice instead of being a series of pipe dreams.
But the left of the party, though few in number, fought the new document all the way with 48 separate amendments.
It looks as if, after 10 years in opposition, we've gone back to the policies that did contribute substantially to our defeat.
As the next election approaches, Labour must sharpen its message, so today it cut down last year's 120,000-word policy document to a mere 20,000. But tonight the Conservatives still attacked it, especially the plans for industrial relations.
Oh, they're getting better at marketing. But the reality is they're still in hock to the unions. They're still dictated by what the union bosses want. They want to take power away from the union members. That's what all these proposals are about.
Whatever the Tory view, today's document commits Labour firmly to the mixed economy. The power for good of market forces is recognised. Business where appropriate, government where necessary, the document says. But so is the absolute need to control inflation. To that end, Labour commits itself to full membership of the European monetary system. There'll be a modest increase in public sector borrowing for things like investment in training and research, but overall public spending will be limited by how much the economy grows or what other savings can be made. On taxation, the party's committed itself to a top rate of income tax at 50% and a bottom rate at 20% or below. The alternative to the poll tax will be property-based and linked to the ability to pay. On trade union laws, there will be an end to the closed shop. Pre-strike ballots and a lot of other Thatcherite legislation will stay, but limited secondary action and picketing will be brought back. Much that used to be highly controversial in Labour policy, like defence, went through almost on the nod today. But with commitments to higher spending on things like the health service and education, where are the controls on public spending?
We're not going to spend money that the country doesn't have. We are committed to a prudent spending policy which has to be related to the economic recovery we intend to bring about. That's always been our position, and the idea of controls, some sort of regulation, doesn't fit into our government system. If the money's not there, a sensible Labour government isn't going to spend it.
Once again today, the power of Mr Kinnock and his supporters on the NEC has been amply demonstrated. For example, this morning the left thought that they'd gained a point with the removal, they believed, of any limit on the numbers of people allowed to take part in secondary picketing. There was confusion for a while, but this afternoon Mr Kinnock called a special vote, and the NEC decided to put back into the document the words, in limited numbers. Michael Brunson, News at 10, at Labour Party headquarters.
Soviet soldiers joined hundreds of demonstrators protesting against independence in Latvia today. The protesters tried to break into the Parliament building in Riga, and police had to beat them back with truncheons. There were similar confrontations in Estonia.
The MPs who declared Latvia independent 11 days ago found themselves under siege today. Riot police guarded the entrance to Parliament as ethnic Russians staged their biggest and angriest anti-independence protests so far. The red flag of Soviet Latvia was waved above a crowd swelled by scores of officers from the Red Army. Latvians regard them as an occupying force, and there were scuffles as, for the second day running, soldiers tried to enter the Parliament building to lodge a protest against independence. Further down the street, a pro-independence counter-demonstration by Latvians. As tension increased, parliamentary leaders, both for and against independence, appealed for calm. But those appeals had little effect. The crowd surged towards Parliament. Riot police moved in, wielding truncheons to restore order. Several Russian demonstrators were beaten. In the melee, Russians fought Latvians, the animosity that's existed between the two groups finally spilling over into violence. In neighbouring Estonia, more anti-independence demonstrations. One group of Russians drove a lorry into the courtyard of Parliament. In Moscow, meanwhile, the US Secretary of State James Baker arrived to lay the groundwork for this month's Washington summit. The Americans want Baltic independence high on the agenda. Mr. Gorbachev still hasn't announced sanctions against Latvia and Estonia, but many observers believe he soon will. They say he needs to take a tough line to reassure military leaders who believe he's been too soft. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
The Soviets are expected to make new proposals tomorrow to break the deadlock in the conventional arms talks in Vienna. The Soviets admit they've been delaying the talks because they're worried about facing a united Germany within NATO. The British Defence Secretary, Mr. Tom King, was told about the new Russian proposals during a visit to Soviet military bases today.
At a Soviet airbase close to Moscow this morning, British Defence Secretary Tom King watched a display by some of the Soviet Union's latest frontline fighters. This first ever visit here by a British Defence Secretary comes at a critical time. East-West negotiations to cut back on conventional weapons like these fighters are held up because the Soviet military are having second thoughts. The Soviet pilots were open about the technical merits of their MiG and Sukhoi fighters, and the British party was impressed, but the military were less open about the extent of their second thoughts on the conventional arms talks.
It's got some problems at the moment, and it's been looking a bit tougher in the last few weeks. Now I don't know whether that's a late stage of bargaining to try and establish a better position, or whether there are really major problems that are going to prove very difficult.
Tomorrow, the Soviet Union is expected to reveal new proposals for the Vienna talks on conventional arms cuts. When those negotiations began, they were between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But since the political upheavals in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact has virtually ceased to exist as a military bloc, and so the Soviet Union now says that some of the ground rules for the negotiations must be rewritten. Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze will reveal the new proposals to US Secretary of State Baker tomorrow. Today he expressed optimism an agreement could still be reached this year. The German question remains a key problem. Despite Mr. King's assurances to a military academy that NATO posed no threat, the idea of a united Germany in NATO is one the Soviet officer corps still finds hard to stomach. Geoffrey Archer, News at 10, Moscow.
Here, Mrs. Thatcher told MPs today that the government's review of the poll tax would be ready in a few weeks' time. She said at question time that no change to the structure of local authorities was planned, but she gave no hints about the changes that are planned.
A man's been jailed for life for the murder of the 9-year-old schoolgirl Annette Wade. Liverpool Crown Court heard how last July John Healy, a jobless labourer, stabbed Annette and then dumped her body on a makeshift bonfire before trying to escape to France.
The two communities in Ireland, the Roman Catholic and the Protestant, the Republic and the North, were both represented at the funeral in St. Patrick's Cathedral, Armagh, today, of Cardinal O'Fee. Sinn Féin were there as well.
The funeral was attended by a who's who of political and church leaders from the whole of Ireland and beyond. Northern Ireland Secretary Peter Brooke positioned next to Irish Premier Charles Haughey, while a short distance away was Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams. More than 300 priests came to pay their respects to a man known as the People's Prelate, and whose passion for all things Irish was reflected in the music. His love of Gaelic football symbolised by the offertory gift of an Armagh County shirt. The Requiem Mass was led by the Bishop of Down and Connor, Dr. Cathal Daly, who reminded the congregation that Cardinal O'Fee had always begged for an end to violence, and added,
"May those committed to violence listen at last in death to this plea from the heart of that great Irishman who was Cardinal Thomas O'Fee."
The coffin was carried gently down the cathedral steps, and Mr. Haughey followed the cortege, shaking hands with mourners. The Sinn Féin men kept a discreet distance away, as the man known to his congregation as Father Tom was laid to rest. Simon Cole, News at 10 in Armagh.
The arms experts are still worrying about just how much of an Iraqi supergun they may have discovered. What the designs may be and what they may or may not add up to, a report next. Plus, how the crew of the crashed airliner weren't trained for trouble. And an old prisoner goes back to the island where his compatriots died. That's in a couple of minutes.